For 3 days, the mountains of Montana swallowed every trace of Vivian Ashcroft. And for 3 days, the country held its breath waiting for news that never came. Helicopters crossed the ridgelines until their fuel ran thin, search dogs lost the scent beneath early snow, and hundreds of trained rescuers walked the same slopes again and again, until their radios carried nothing but static and exhaustion. When the search command finally shifted its language from finding her to recovering her, only one man, in that entire wilderness, refused to accept the change. Brennan Cross lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the tree line, far from the command tents and the camera crews. And he did not believe what the experts believed: a single footprint near a half-frozen creek. A pine branch snapped in a direction the wind could not explain, and a thread of smoke too faint for any drone to register were enough to send him walking in the opposite direction from every official map. At dawn the following morning, in a fold of rock, the rescue teams had crossed off their grid 2 days earlier. Brennan found the richest woman in the state still breathing. What he did not yet know was that the thing hunting her through those woods was far more patient and far more dangerous than the mountain itself. The mountains of that country did not forgive mistakes easily. And everyone who worked search and rescue in that region knew it. Temperatures at elevation dropped without warning once the sun slid behind the western ridges, and a person caught without shelter after dark faced a slow, quiet kind of danger that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with physics, the simple mathematics of a body losing heat faster than it could produce it. The search coordinators understood this better than anyone, which was exactly why, on the third morning, the official language shifted from urgency to procedure, and volunteers who had hiked themselves raw over 3 days were told to stand down and rest. Nobody blamed them for it. Statistics did not leave much room for hope past a certain number of hours, and every person in that command tent had seen enough of these situations to know how the story usually ended. What none of them accounted for was a man who did not read statistics, who had never once in his working life trusted a number over the evidence sitting directly in front of him, and who was, at that very moment, quietly packing a bag 40 miles away while the rest of the world prepared to give up. Vivian Ashcroft had built an empire out of pipelines and power grids, and she ran it the way she ran everything else in her life, with numbers instead of instinct and contracts instead of trust. She was 39 years old, the chief executive of Ashcroft Global Energy, and widely regarded as one of the most formidable women in American industry. That week, she had chartered a private helicopter to a mountain resort where she intended to close a deal that would double her company's holdings in the Northern Territories. The flight was supposed to take 40 minutes. Reporters later noted that her pilot filed a clean route, that visibility at takeoff had been rated acceptable, and that nothing in the Weather Service's early warnings suggested the storm that rolled in over the ridge with almost no notice, somewhere above a canyon with no name on any civilian map. The helicopter's transponder blinked out, and with it went every certainty the world had about where Vivian Ashcroft was and whether she was still alive. She had built her career on the belief that any problem could be solved if enough data was applied to it correctly, a philosophy that had carried her from a mid-level analyst position to the head of one of the largest energy companies in the country in under 15 years. Colleagues who respected her called it discipline. Colleagues who feared her called it something closer to ruthlessness, though few of them ever said so where she might hear it. She trusted spreadsheets over instinct, trusted contracts over handshakes, and had built her entire adult identity around the conviction that emotion was simply a variable other people had failed to control for. It was that same instinct for control that had scheduled the mountain flight in the first place, a calculated risk weighed against a deal too valuable to delay. And it was the sudden, total absence of control in that storm that would eventually teach her more than any boardroom ever had. The disappearance became a national story within hours. News anchors repeated her name so often it lost its shape. Financial markets reacted before rescue teams had even reached the search zone, and shares of Ashcroft Global fell sharply on the first morning, then kept falling as the days wore on without a sign of wreckage. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a file. State police mobilized every available unit. Search and rescue coordinators from 3 counties converged on a staging area at the base of the mountain bringing with them thermal drones, trained cadaver dogs, and volunteers who hiked ridgelines until their boots filled with blood. None of it produced anything more than false alarms and cold trails. By the third day, the language in the official briefings had begun to soften into the vocabulary of closure rather than rescue, and the search maps that hung in the command tent had already been marked with red lines through the sectors, judged impossible to survive. 40 miles from that command tent, Brennan Cross was mending a fence around his cabin and paying no attention to any of it. He was 41 years old, a former national park ranger who had spent nearly 2 decades reading terrain the way other men read newspapers, and he had not owned a television in years. He did not follow the news, did not carry a phone with any signal worth trusting, and had built his life around a kind of silence that most people found unsettling and he found necessary. His wife had died 6 winters earlier, and after her funeral, he had walked away from every title and every obligation that once defined him, choosing instead the company of pine trees and weather and work that used his hands. An old colleague from his ranger days, a heavy-set man named Walter Ruiz, who still worked dispatch for the county, drove up the gravel road that afternoon to ask if Brennan had noticed anything strange in the woods over the past few days. Brennan straightened from his work, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked out toward the tree line before answering. He said that if the searchers were following a map, they would never find her, because the mountain did not care what any map said. Walter did not understand the remark and did not ask him to explain it. He left without pressing further, the way most people did with Brennan, and the cabin went quiet again. That night, as the temperature dropped and the wind shifted out of the northwest, Brennan stepped outside to check on his woodpile and noticed something that made him stop entirely still. A flock of birds rose all at once from a valley that had been silent for years, scattering upward in a panic that had nothing to do with weather. He watched them for a long moment, reading the shape of their flight the way another man might read a sentence, and something in the pattern told him that whatever had startled them was not an animal and was not the wind. Without a word to anyone, because there was no one left to tell, he went back inside, filled a canvas pack with rope, a medical kit, and a headlamp, and walked out into the dark toward the one place every official search team had already ruled impossible. He did not follow the trail the rescue teams had been using, the wide logging road that wound up the eastern face of the mountain in long, easy switchbacks meant for trucks and stretchers. Instead, he cut west, into terrain that had no name on any topographic chart, guided only by things a satellite could not measure. He studied the direction of the wind funneling through the canyon, noted how the creek ran higher and colder than it should have for that time of year, and traced a line of broken branches that curved unnaturally against the slope, as though something heavy had come down through the trees rather than crashing straight into the ground. A helicopter falling under normal conditions left a debris field that spread outward in a predictable cone, and every official map had been drawn around that assumption. But Brennan had spent years learning that mountains rarely behaved the way assumptions demanded, and if the aircraft had been forced down at an angle by wind shear along that particular ridge, the wreckage would not be anywhere near the zones the searchers had already exhausted. While hundreds of rescuers packed up their equipment and pulled back from the higher elevations as darkness fell, Brennan kept climbing. Rain turned to drizzle, and drizzle thickened into a fog that pressed close against the trees, cutting visibility down to a few dozen feet in any direction. He moved carefully, testing each foothold before trusting his weight to it, aware that a broken ankle out here would be its own kind of death sentence. An hour into the fog, he found a shard of curved glass wedged in the bark of a fir tree, still sharp enough to cut his glove when he picked it up. A few steps further, dark spots on a flat stone that could only have been blood, already thinned by the rain. Then, caught in a tangle of exposed roots, a wristwatch far too expensive for anyone who lived in these hills. Its crystal face cracked, but its hands still moving. He turned the watch over in his palm, feeling the weight of confirmation settle into his chest, and pushed on into the fog, with a renewed sense that he was close. Even though there was still no sign of the woman herself, he catalogued each object the way he had once catalogued evidence during his ranger years, noting the direction it had come to rest, the way the moss beneath the watch had been disturbed only recently, the absence of any drag marks that might have suggested an animal carrying it there instead. Nothing about the scene matched the debris field the official searchers had mapped 2 ridges over, and the further he climbed, the more convinced he became that the entire search effort had been anchored to a false assumption from its very first hour. One small, early error compounding itself over 3 days until it had steered hundreds of trained searchers entirely away from where a dying woman actually lay. He thought, as he climbed, about the years he had spent teaching younger rangers the same lesson that guided him now, that a map was only ever a summary of what the land had once looked like, never a promise of what it looked like today. Storms moved rock. Floods rerouted streams. A single hard winter could reshape a slope enough to send a search team combing through country that no longer matched the terrain they thought they understood. He had watched, more than once in his old career, experienced searchers walk directly past a survivor because their training told them to trust the grid instead of their own eyes, and he had promised himself long ago that he would never let a piece of paper make a decision his instincts were better equipped to make. That promise was the only thing pulling him forward now, up a slope with no trail and no comfort, toward a woman he had never met and had no reason to believe was still alive at all, except for the birds and the wind and the quiet certainty that had settled into his chest the moment he saw them scatter. The night stretched longer than any he could remember. Twice he lost the trail entirely and had to double back, running his palm along the bark of trees to feel for disturbance, listening for any sound beneath the constant hiss of rain on the canopy. His legs ached from the climb, and his hands had gone numb from the cold. But he did not turn back, because turning back had never once occurred to him as an option. Sometime after midnight, in the stillness between one gust of wind and the next, he heard something that did not belong to the forest. It was faint, almost swallowed by the rain. A rhythmic tapping sound, like knuckles or a stone striking rock in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. He stood motionless, straining to place its direction, and when it came again, he was already moving toward it before he had consciously decided to. The sky had only just begun to gray with the first suggestion of morning when Brennan finally traced the sound to its source. Beneath a shelf of broken rock, hidden from every angle the search helicopters would have flown, he found a narrow crevice where the mountain had folded in on itself long before any road existed. Wedged into that crevice, wrapped in the remains of a torn jacket and shivering so hard her teeth had stopped chattering, was Vivian Ashcroft. Her face was pale beneath a layer of dried blood. One leg twisted at an angle that told him to break before she said a word, and her lips had gone the color of the fog around them. She looked up at him with eyes that had already begun to lose focus. And in a voice, barely above a whisper, she asked if he was with the rescue team. Brennan knelt beside her, checking her pulse against her throat, and answered with a single word. "No," he said, and then he began working the straps of his pack loose to reach the emergency blanket inside. He did not ask her name. He did not yet know who she was, and in that moment, it did not matter to him at all. He worked quickly and without wasted motion, splinting her leg with a length of branch and strips torn from his own shirt, forcing water from his canteen past her cracked lips a few careful sips at a time. When he judged her stable enough to move, he lifted her onto his back in a fireman's carry that his body remembered from 100 old training exercises, and began the long descent toward his cabin, the only shelter he trusted within reach. Neither of them spoke much during that walk. She drifted in and out of consciousness against his shoulder, and he kept his focus locked on the ground ahead, choosing each step with the same care he had used to find her. What he did not see, and what she was too far gone to notice, was the glint of sunlight catching off a lens far down the valley, where a pair of binoculars tracked their slow progress through the trees with an attention that had nothing to do with rescue. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had fully risen, spilling pale light across the clearing and the woodpile Brennan had been mending only a day earlier, a lifetime ago by the feel of it. He laid Vivienne on the narrow bed in the back room, built up the fire until the cabin's chill began to lift, and set about cleaning the wound on her leg with the same steady hands he had used to splint it in the field. She woke slowly, her eyes focusing on the low wooden ceiling, and then on the man moving quietly beside her, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, as though trying to decide whether she had actually survived, or simply dreamed of survival. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been on the mountain, though it still carried the rasp of 3 days without proper water. She told him the helicopter had not simply fallen out of the sky. She had felt something detonate beneath the cabin floor of the aircraft, a jolt too sharp and too localized to be weather, seconds before the pilot lost control entirely. It had not felt like an accident, she said, and she had spent every hour since telling herself she was wrong, because the alternative was too dangerous to consider while lying broken in a crevice, with no way to defend herself. Brennan listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing, though inside his mind he was already running back through everything he had seen on the mountain, the strange angle of the broken branches, the debris pattern that made no sense for a simple mechanical failure. He had spent enough years around search and rescue investigations to recognize when a story did not add up. And hers, paired with what his own eyes had already told him, did not add up at all. He did not share his suspicions with her yet, choosing instead to focus on getting more fluids into her system and checking the splint on her leg for signs of swelling. He worked with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this kind of triage many times before. Boiling water on the wood stove, tearing clean cloth into strips, checking her pupils by firelight for any sign of concussion he might have missed on the mountain. Vivienne watched him move around the small cabin, noting the economy in every gesture, nothing wasted, nothing performed for an audience, and found herself struck by how unfamiliar that quality had become to her. Every person she worked with performed for someone, a boardroom, a camera, a shareholder somewhere down the line. This man performed for no one, because as far as he understood it, there was no one left watching who mattered to him, and something in that realization unsettled her more than the pain in her leg. Outside, as evening approached, he noticed a set of headlights sweeping briefly along the tree line at the bottom of his access road, far earlier than any patrol he expected, and far too quiet for an official vehicle. He said nothing to Vivienne about it, but he moved the rifle from its case above the door within easier reach, and he did not sit with his back to the window again. Later that night, as the fire burned low and Vivienne slept fitfully in the next room, a heavy knock landed on the cabin door, 3 deliberate strikes that carried none of the urgency a real rescue team would have brought. 3 men stood on the porch when Brennan opened the door, dressed in gear that looked correct at a glance but wrong on closer inspection. Jackets a shade too clean for anyone who had spent days in these woods, boots without a scuff of real mileage on them. They introduced themselves as part of an independent search coalition assisting the official effort, and said they had reason to believe the missing woman was somewhere in this sector. Brennan kept his body angled in the doorway, blocking the view into the cabin, and studied them the way he had once studied poachers who claimed to be lost hunters. The tread on their boots was wrong for search work. Too shallow, too new. One man's hand rested near his hip in a way that had nothing to do with reaching for a radio, and the grip he kept on the pistol beneath his jacket was clumsy, the grip of someone who had trained with weapons, but never trusted them the way a real professional would. Brennan told them calmly that he had seen nothing, that his cabin was too far from the search corridor to be relevant, and suggested they try the ranger station 6 miles east. The lead man's eyes drifted past Brennan's shoulder, toward the faint light spilling from the back room. And in that instant, Brennan understood exactly what kind of men had come to his door. For a long, taut moment, nobody on that porch moved. The wind pushed through the pines behind the 3 strangers, carrying with it the faint metallic smell that Brennan had already learned to associate with danger, gun oil and something else beneath it, adrenaline sweat masked poorly by cheap cologne. He kept his shoulders loose and his voice even, aware that the smallest flicker of alarm on his face would tell these men everything they needed to know. Years of standing in front of frightened hikers and angry poachers alike had taught him that most confrontations were decided in the first 4 seconds, before a single word was even exchanged, by whoever controlled their own breathing the best. He controlled his. The lead man's gaze kept drifting past him, toward the seam of light beneath the back room door, and Brennan understood that every second he held their attention on his face, instead of that light, was a second bought for the woman lying in his bed with a shattered leg and no way to run. He did not raise his voice, and did not reach for the rifle resting behind the door, aware that any sudden move would collapse the fragile advantage of their uncertainty. Instead, he apologized for the trouble, said he would keep an eye out and radio if anything turned up, and eased the door shut with the calm deliberateness of a man closing up for the night, rather than a man who had just recognized 3 armed strangers as hunters rather than rescuers. The moment the latch clicked, he moved fast, waking Vivienne with a hand over her mouth to keep her silent, lifting her from the bed despite her protest of pain, and guiding her toward a trapdoor beneath the kitchen floorboards that led to an old maintenance tunnel left over from the cabin's earlier life as a ranger outpost. He had used it exactly once before, years ago, to escape a wildfire that had come through faster than any warning system predicted. And he had never expected to need it again. As they descended into the narrow dark, the sound of glass breaking echoed from somewhere above them, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable crackle of flame catching dry wood. By the time they emerged from the tunnel's far end into the cold night air, Brennan's cabin, the only home he had built for himself since his wife's death, was already burning against the black tree line behind them. They moved through the forest in silence for nearly an hour, Vivienne leaning heavily on Brennan's shoulder, her splinted leg dragging with every other step, until he judged them far enough from the fire's glow to risk a rest. An old fire lookout station, abandoned for at least a decade, stood tucked into a stand of lodgepole pine a mile further up the ridge, its windows boarded, but its structure sound enough to shelter them until dawn. Inside, wrapped in a dust-covered blanket he found folded in a supply closet, Vivienne finally told him the rest of what she had been carrying since the helicopter first shuddered under her. A deal worth tens of billions of dollars had been quietly moving through her company's board for months, a restructuring that would consolidate control among a small circle of shareholders if she were no longer able to vote her own shares. Her death, or her permanent incapacitation, stood to benefit that circle more than almost anyone else on Earth. And in the confusion of a genuine tragedy, no one would think to look twice at how conveniently timed it had all been. She had spent the last 2 years surrounded by people whose loyalty she had never fully trusted, and sitting in that cold, abandoned station, she admitted for the first time in years that she did not know a single person left in her life she was certain would not profit from her disappearance. She talked for a long while after that, more than she had intended to, the words coming loose the way they sometimes did for people who had spent years holding everything behind a practiced, professional calm. She told him about board meetings where every smile around the table concealed a calculation, about advisors who measured their loyalty in stock options rather than years, about the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who could not afford to relax. She had built an empire that employed thousands of people and could not, in that cold abandoned tower, name a single one of them she trusted completely with her own life. Brennan listened the way he listened to the forest, without interrupting, letting her reach the end of her own thought before he offered anything back. It struck her, somewhere in the middle of the telling, that she could not remember the last time anyone had simply let her finish a sentence without steering it toward their own interest. Her voice broke on the last sentence, not from fear of the men who had burned down the cabin, but from the quieter grief of realizing how alone she truly was. Brennan said little in response, letting the silence hold the weight of what she had confessed, rather than filling it with empty reassurance. After a long while, he reached into his pack and withdrew a small twisted piece of metal he had pulled from the wreckage site before ever finding her, a fragment scorched black along one edge, in a pattern that no simple mechanical failure would produce. He had recognized it immediately for what it was, evidence of a deliberate charge rather than an accident. But he had said nothing about it until now, wanting to be certain before he handed her a truth that would change everything. When he placed it in her palm, Vivienne went perfectly still, staring at the fragment as though it were a piece of her own body, rather than a scrap of destroyed machinery, and for the first time since the crash, the color drained entirely from her face. She asked him, once she had found her voice again, why a man with his obvious skill lived so completely alone, so far from anyone who might need saving. Brennan did not answer right away, choosing his words the way he chose his footing on unstable ground. He told her about his wife, about the accident that had taken her on a stretch of icy highway 6 winters earlier, and about the years afterward, when he had walked away from every rank and title the Park Service had offered him, unable to keep serving people while feeling as though he had failed to save the one person who mattered most. He had built the cabin with his own hands as a place to disappear into, not out of self-pity, he explained, but because silence had become the only thing that did not ask anything of him. Vivienne studied his face while he spoke, and something in her expression shifted. The practiced skepticism she brought to every boardroom, giving way to something quieter and more genuine. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by men who wanted something from her fortune, her name, or her influence, and here, in a burned-out lookout tower on the edge of nowhere, sat a man who had risked his life to save her before he even knew who she was, and who wanted nothing from her at all. Near dawn, the satellite phone Brennan carried in his emergency kit finally caught a signal strong enough to hold, chirping to life with a burst of static that startled them both awake from the light doze they had fallen into. He used it to relay a coded message to Walter back at dispatch, describing their location in terms only another ranger would understand, careful not to broadcast anything a scanner could easily decode. But even a brief signal left a trace, and less than 20 minutes later, the same men who had burned his cabin appeared at the tree line below the lookout station, moving with the coordinated pace of people who had triangulated a position rather than stumbled onto one by luck. Brennan understood immediately that the tower offered no real defense, only a clear line of sight for whoever controlled the ground beneath it, and that their only real advantage now lay in the same terrain that had already saved Vivienne's life once. He led her down the back slope of the ridge, away from the direction their pursuers expected, choosing a route through a narrow defile where loose scree made pursuit slow and noisy for anyone unfamiliar with the ground. Vivienne, despite the pain radiating up from her splinted leg, kept pace as best she could, gripping a walking stick Brennan had cut for her from a fallen branch. And somewhere in that grueling descent, she stopped thinking of him as a stranger who happened to find her, and started understanding him as the only steady thing left in her world. They crossed a shallow stream where the cold water numbed her leg enough to dull the pain temporarily, climbed along a narrow ledge above a rock slide that Brennan knew from memory rather than any map, and finally reached a hidden game trail that wound behind a waterfall few people even knew existed. He did not carry a firearm with any real stopping power, and he did not need one, because every choice he made in that landscape was itself a kind of weapon, one built from decades of understanding what the mountain would and would not forgive. The forest around them changed character as the elevation dropped, the tight stands of lodgepole pine giving way to older growth, trunks wide enough that two people could have stood behind one and disappeared entirely from view. Brennan used that cover instinctively, weaving their path from trunk to trunk rather than crossing open ground, reading the slope ahead for the places where fallen timber and boulder fields would slow anyone chasing them who did not know the ground as intimately as he did. Vivienne found herself watching his shoulders rather than the trail itself, matching her pace to the rhythm of his movement. And somewhere in that long, aching descent she noticed that fear had quietly stopped controlling her breathing. It was not that the danger had lessened. It was that she had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, placed her survival entirely in someone else's hands, and found that her body no longer fought the decision. Behind them, the pursuit grew louder and more frantic, as their pursuers realized how badly the terrain was working against them, voices carrying oaths and instructions across the ravine that the wind occasionally twisted back toward Brennan and Vivienne, giving away just enough of their pursuers' position to stay one step ahead. Vivienne watched Brennan navigate each obstacle with a calm that had nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with earned confidence, and somewhere in the exhaustion of that flight, she found herself thinking that all the wealth and power she had spent her life accumulating had never once given her the kind of security she felt walking behind this quiet man through a forest trying to kill her. Power, she realized, had done nothing to protect her out here. Calm, competent patience had. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first true colors of morning, the two of them broke from the tree line into a wide alpine meadow, and there, cutting low across the ridge, came the unmistakable shape of a rescue helicopter running its official search pattern, the first real search aircraft either of them had seen since the crash. Brennan pulled a flare from his pack and fired it skyward without hesitation, watching the red trail arc above the meadow, and for a moment relief flooded through both of them at the sight of the helicopter banking hard toward their position. But relief lasted only seconds. Behind them, breaking from the same tree line they had just escaped, the three armed men emerged into the open meadow, weapons finally drawn without pretense, closing the distance with the desperate urgency of people who understood that daylight and witnesses meant the end of everything they had been sent to accomplish. What followed happened faster than either of them could fully process in the moment, though every detail of it would later be picked apart in painstaking testimony. Brennan pulled Vivian down behind a fallen log at the meadow's edge as the helicopter's spotlight swept the open ground, catching the armed men fully illuminated in a wash of white light they had no way to escape. State police, alerted by Walter's relay hours earlier, arrived on the ground almost simultaneously, moving in from the access road with weapons raised and orders shouted across the open meadow. The confrontation ended without a single shot fired, the three men surrendering the instant they understood the helicopter above them was broadcasting live to a command post that already had federal agents standing by. Within the hour, Brennan handed over the scorched fragment of metal he had carried through 2 days of pursuit, along with a clear, unhurried account of everything he had seen on the mountain. And by that afternoon, federal investigators had already begun tracing the fragment back to a supplier connected to members of Ashcroft Global's own board. The story that broke across every news outlet that evening bore almost no resemblance to the one the world had expected. The woman everyone believed dead had not been found by an elite tactical team or a state-of-the-art rescue unit, but by a solitary man living off the grid with no phone, no television, and no interest in the fortune or fame his discovery would bring him. Reporters descended on the small mountain county within hours, hungry for interviews, but Brennan had already vanished back into the tree line before a single camera crew arrived at the hospital, where Vivienne was being treated. She refused every press conference the hospital's public relations team tried to arrange, insisting instead that she needed to see the man who had saved her before she said a single word to anyone else. When she finally had herself discharged against medical advice and driven up the long gravel road to his cabin, she found only ash and a scorched foundation where the structure had once stood, and pinned beneath a stone at the edge of the clearing, a single folded sheet of paper in Brennan's careful handwriting, saying only that he needed time and that she should not look for him the way everyone else had once looked for her. Weeks passed before Vivienne learned, through Walter and a quiet network of old ranger contacts, that Brennan had taken up temporary work rebuilding trail shelters in a national forest 2 counties over, choosing physical labor and solitude, the way he always had whenever the world pressed in too close. She did not send investigators after him, and did not use her considerable resources to track him down, the way she might have tracked down anyone else who owed her something. Instead, she waited, allowing him the same patience he had shown her in that burned-out lookout tower. And when enough time had passed that it no longer felt like an intrusion, she drove herself out to the small ranger district office where he had been staying, without an assistant, without security, and without a single camera trailing behind her. She found him exactly as she had imagined she would, high on a ladder repairing the roof of a trail shelter, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the late autumn cold, entirely unaware of the car pulling into the gravel lot below. When he climbed down and saw her standing there, he did not seem surprised so much as quietly unsurprised, as though some part of him had expected this exact moment to arrive eventually, once she had healed enough to come looking on her own terms rather than anyone else's. She told him that the entire world had searched for her with helicopters and satellites, and every resource money could summon. And none of it had found her at all. Only he had found her, she said, using nothing but patience, judgment, and a kind of attention the rest of the world had forgotten how to give another human being. Brennan allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine one she had seen from him since the mountain, and told her that the forest never lied to anyone willing to actually listen to it, unlike almost everything else in her old life. She laughed at that, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch her as much as it caught him, and admitted she could not remember the last time something had made her laugh without calculation behind it. He offered her a cup of coffee poured from a battered percolator that had clearly seen better decades, and she took it without complaint, sitting on an overturned crate because the small office had no proper furniture for guests, feeling more at ease in that plain, unheated room than she had felt in any of the marble lobbies that carried her name. They spoke for a long while that morning, not about the crash or the men who had chased them, but about smaller things, the way the light moved differently through pine forests depending on the season, the names of birds she had never bothered to learn, the particular quiet of a place, with no schedule pressing against it. Brennan found himself talking more than he had in years, surprising even himself, with how easily the words came once someone was actually listening for them rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Vivienne noticed the change in him too. The way his guardedness loosened by degrees the longer they sat there, and understood without needing to be told that trust, for a man like this, was not given quickly but was, once given, given completely. They sat together on the porch steps of the small ranger office as the sun rose fully over the tree line, saying little, comfortable in a silence that had once felt foreign to Vivienne, and now felt like the only honest language she had left. In the weeks that followed, she announced the creation of a new Wilderness Rescue Foundation, funded personally, rather than through her company, dedicated to training search teams in the same terrain-based methods that had saved her life when every piece of modern technology had failed. She asked Brennan to serve as its lead consultant, not as a figurehead for publicity but as the actual architect of its training program. And after several days of quiet consideration, he agreed, not for the money the position would have paid him, since he refused most of it, but because the idea of other lost people being found the way he had found her mattered to him in a way very little had mattered since his wife's death. Word of what had actually happened on that mountain spread far beyond the county line, told and retold, until it settled into something close to local legend. The story of a quiet man who had walked out into a storm everyone else had already surrendered to, and come back with the one thing an entire nation's resources had failed to find. Reporters tried for weeks to draw him into interviews, offering sums of money that would have startled him years earlier. Back when money still meant something more to him than paper, he declined every one of them, not out of stubbornness but because he genuinely could not understand what value there was in narrating an act that, to him, had simply been the obvious thing to do. Vivienne understood that reluctance better than any producer chasing a story ever could. And she made certain, quietly and without announcement, that his privacy stayed protected even as her own life returned to a version of the public eye she had once taken for granted. The conspiracy within her own company unraveled over the following months. Board members and shareholders indicted one by one as investigators traced the money and the motive back through years of carefully hidden transactions. Brennan's name, once known only to a handful of old colleagues and the wilderness he moved through, became known across the country as the quiet stranger who had refused to believe a map when his own instincts told him otherwise, though he never once sought out the attention that followed. Vivienne, for her part, found herself slowly relearning how to trust the people around her. A lesson she suspected would take longer than any physical injury to fully heal. Though she no longer faced it alone, what grew between them in the months after was not the kind of romance either of them had known before. No declarations, no rush toward anything neither was ready for, only a steady, patient trust built one quiet morning at a time. The foundation grew faster than either of them expected, drawing volunteers from search and rescue units across several states, eager to learn methods that relied on reading terrain rather than waiting on technology that could fail at the worst possible moment. Brennan spent his weeks training young rangers the same way he had once been trained himself, walking them through forests at dawn, teaching them to notice broken branches and disturbed moss and the particular silence that fell over a valley when something had gone wrong within it. Vivienne, for her part, learned to sit in meetings again without the old armor she had once needed, discovering that honesty, offered plainly and without calculation, tended to earn far more loyalty than fear ever had. On the evenings when she drove up to visit him at the new cabin he had begun building not far from where the old one had burned, they would sit together and watch the light change over the Montana ridgeline, and in that stillness, neither of them needed a single word to understand exactly what had been found in that forest, and what neither of them intended to lose again.